Have you ever felt like your mind is slipping away from you? Like no matter how hard you try to focus, to memorize, to hold on to something, it disappears. In a world full of noise, deadlines, distractions, have you ever stopped to ask, what does it really mean to remember? Not just to store facts, but to truly remember, with presence, with purpose, with peace. Somewhere, 1,000 years ago, beneath the silent watch of a moonlit sky, a young man sat alone, surrounded by scrolls and shadows. His name was Avicenna, but in his own world, he was simply Ibn Sina, a name whispered across generations. A man who listened to the language of stars, dissected the whispers of the human mind, and wrote of things long before the world believed they mattered. The West was asleep, draped in superstition, entangled in fear, but in the East, under flickering candlelight and with ink-stained fingers, a Muslim scholar, barely more than a boy, was already diagnosing the ailments of the soul. He didn't chase cures in hospitals or behind pill bottles. He sought remedies in the inner sanctums of the human spirit. One of his most profound studies? Memory. Not memory as we know it today, bytes and backups, names and numbers. For him, memory was sacred, a living force, a mysterious guest that lived deep within the corridors of our being. It had rules, strengths, sicknesses, even seasons. He believed it could be trained, nurtured, and healed. And he wasn't just guessing. He mapped the mind the way ancient navigators mapped the stars. With reverence, with awe, with the belief that what lies within us might be even more infinite than what lies above. To Avicenna, the mind wasn't a singular thing. It was a layered palace. At the foundation, the intellect, the part of us that seeks meaning, understands symbols, deciphers ideas. Above that, the imagination, where images are painted, reconstructed, and lived again in dreamlike clarity. And then, at the highest chamber, the preserver, the guardian, the memory itself. That which stores, that which holds, that which remembers. But he didn't see these as separate rooms. They were threads in one tapestry, each depending on the others to exist. If the imagination frayed, memory would dim. If the body weakened, so would the soul's ability to hold on to what matters. Health, environment, food, emotion, all were interlinked with the brain's capacity to remember. He wrote of how memory declines when we overeat or oversleep, of how intellectual activity, movement, and even repetition are nourishment for the remembering mind. And 1,000 years later, science caught up. We now speak of neuroplasticity, mindfulness, cognitive load. But long before the jargon, there was a man with a pen and a belief that the soul is more than bones and blood. It is something to be cultivated. He believed that what we remember is not just content, but connection. That memory isn't made of data, it's made of meaning. In his masterpiece, The Book of Healing, Avicenna gave us more than theory, he gave us instruction. Practical steps. Golden principles that still shimmer with relevance. He pointed to the back of the head and said, "Here. Here lies memory's throne." He taught that damage to this region, by way of corrupted air, spoiled food, or even excessive heat or cold, would disturb the memory's function. He didn't need an MRI to understand this. He simply listened to the body as one listens to an instrument out of tune. He warned against excess. Too much warmth could burn the mind's clarity. Too much cold could freeze its movement. Too little sleep made thoughts scatter like leaves in wind. Too much sleep turned the intellect slow and heavy. What he described in poetic intuition, we now explain in neural chemistry. But both say the same thing. Memory lives in balance. He taught us to ventilate our rooms, to breathe clean air, to keep our diets simple, to walk and think and stretch the brain the way we stretch muscles. And perhaps most beautifully, he reminded us that what we want to remember must be revisited, not once, but often. Not passively, but purposefully. What we now call spaced repetition, he called companionship with thought. And isn't that what memory truly is? A companionship with our own past, with our own selves. He even spoke of foods, not as trends or fads, but as sacred tools. To him, each organ had a food, a medicine, a rhythm, and the brain, our greatest organ, deserved nothing less than reverent care. He spoke of raisins, quince, dry coriander, lettuce, hazelnuts. Not just because they were available, but because he understood their nature. Raisins, he said, purified the brain and awakened memory. Quince strengthened comprehension. Coriander quieted anxiety and preserved images. Lettuce calmed the nerves. Hazelnuts nourished awareness. And now, centuries later, we know these are rich in antioxidants. Brain foods, smart foods. But to him, they were more than nutrients. They were harmony in edible form. They were the whispers of nature helping us remember who we are. He saw the body as a mirror of the mind. Feed one, and the other glows. Neglect one, and both suffer. But what happens when memory fails us? Avicenna didn't deny forgetfulness. In fact, he categorized it. Sometimes, he said, we forget because the body is unwell. The brain, like any organ, can become inflamed, injured, diseased. Other times, the cause is chaos, too much thinking, too much noise, too many open doors in the mind without any closing behind them. Distraction becomes a kind of decay. And sometimes, the culprit is laziness, apathy, the absence of intentional repetition. When we don't exercise memory, it simply sits. And anything that sits too long begins to fade. To heal, he said, we must begin with rest. Not laziness, but deliberate rest. A gentle discipline. Then comes nourishment. Then comes understanding. Only then, he said, should we begin to memorize. With meaning, with structure, with care, and not all at once. Instead, slowly, like pouring water into a vessel, drop by drop. Repetition, not force. Association, not memorization for its own sake. And when you do try to learn, read aloud. Move your hands. Let your voice rise and fall. Engage more than your eyes. Let your whole body be involved. The body remembers what the mind alone forgets. What we now call multisensory encoding, he understood intuitively. Speak it, hear it, feel it. This was his memory palace. In the end, Avicenna was not just a man of science. He was a man of the soul, a philosopher who believed that the mind is not a hard drive, but a garden. And gardens don't store, they bloom. He didn't just want us to memorize facts. He wanted us to become wiser. He wanted memory not just for exams, but for life. To remember kindness, to remember silence, to remember the sound of our mother's voice, to remember what it feels like to be seen, to remember what we've read, yes, but also what we've lived. Because, to him, memory was not storage. It was a way of staying human. But there's more. Avicenna didn't stop at the mind alone. He turned his gaze inward, toward the very nerves that ran through the human body like rivers beneath the earth, hidden, but essential. He explored how the brain speaks to the body, how the tiniest tremor of imbalance could cloud the clearest thought. He believed the nervous system wasn't just a conduit for sensation, it was the architecture of remembrance. In his most celebrated work, The Canon of Medicine, he wrote of the profound relationship between the brain, the nerves, and memory. He identified the seat of memory at the back of the brain, not merely as metaphor, but as an anatomical truth. And he explained, in language that echoes across centuries, how memory could be weakened by heat, dampness, poor air, or spoiled food. It's easy to forget how radical this was in his time, how ahead of it. He was describing chemical imbalances before we even had the language for chemicals. He was diagnosing neurological fatigue before we had brain scans. And he warned of things we still battle today: polluted environments, overstimulation, poor diets, sleeplessness. His solution? Not pharmaceuticals, not gadgets. Balance. Ventilate the room. Regulate the diet. Sleep, but not too much. Move, but not to the point of exhaustion. Think, but pause long enough to feel. The wisdom feels ancient, but also brand new. As if we're finally catching up to something our ancestors once knew but forgot. Something about stillness. Something about rhythm. Something about treating the mind not like a machine, but like a guest in our home. Something to be honored, nourished, and heard. He even offered techniques, not in the form of apps or charts, but in a soft return to the natural. When you want to remember something, he said, read it aloud. Then repeat it. Then move your hand while doing so. Not because he believed in superstition, but because he understood something fundamental. Memory is embodied. When we involve movement, when we hear ourselves speak, when we give the body a role in learning, the memory deepens. It becomes part of us. It is no longer information, it is transformation. And then came food, not as indulgence, but as medicine. As music for the mind. In Avicenna's view, every organ in the body was nourished by certain foods, and the brain, our most subtle, most mysterious organ, was no exception. His prescriptions were simple, natural, yet grounded in careful observation and spiritual awareness. He recommended raisins to awaken memory and cleanse the brain, quince to improve understanding and repel forgetfulness, dry coriander to calm the anxious mind and protect visual imagery, lettuce to soothe the nerves, hazelnuts to feed the intellect. He wasn't trying to sell a diet. He was describing a harmony. The foods were not just fuel, but instruments. And when played together in balance, they could restore the song of thought. And once again, centuries later, we found out he was right. Modern science has confirmed that raisins are rich in antioxidants that fight memory decline. Quince supports neuroplasticity. Hazelnuts are loaded with brain-boosting fats. We call this functional nutrition. He called it knowing your body. But there was one thing Avicenna feared more than bad food. It was chaos, distraction, overindulgence. The mind, he believed, could drown in too much. Too much noise, too much thought, too much motion. And when the mind drowns, memory becomes the first thing to sink. So he warned, do not overeat. Do not oversleep. Do not clutter your days with noise. And when you study, study with calm. Not anxiety, not ambition, but with presence, as if the very act of learning is an offering. He also categorized forgetfulness. Not all forgetfulness is equal, he said. There is forgetfulness born of illness, when something in the brain's structure has faltered. That kind of forgetting is physical. Then there is the forgetfulness that comes from scattering the mind, too many thoughts pulling in too many directions. No wonder nothing stays. And finally, there is the forgetfulness that comes from neglect, from failing to return to what we once knew, from failing to care. And his remedy? He didn't just say, try harder. He said, begin again. Gently, respectfully. Start with rest. Then organize your food, your thoughts, your sleep. Then revisit what matters, not once, but with rhythm. And when you read, read out loud. When you memorize, do so with intention. When you want to remember, link what you learn to a sound, a gesture, a place. Memory, he believed, is not stored in the brain alone. It is stored in space. In breath, in motion. Today we call these memory palaces and mnemonics. He simply called it understanding the nature of the mind. And there's a strange comfort in that, isn't there? To know that remembering is not just a trick or a talent. It is a kind of love, a practice, a devotion. He left us a map, a method, a path to clarity. 5 steps, each one more timeless than the last. First, clear the mind before learning. Do not study when full. Do not try to absorb knowledge when agitated. The door to the mind will not open if the heart is in chaos. Wait until there is stillness. Then begin. Second, choose your time. He believed the best time to memorize was just before dawn, at the cusp of morning light, when the world is quiet, when the brain, he said, is at its sharpest. And modern science? It now tells us that at dawn, the brain enters a wave state ideal for deep learning. A moment when the veil between the conscious and the unconscious is thinnest. Third, read aloud, again and again. Let your voice echo through your body. Move your hands as you speak. Use the entire self. Let what you learn pass not only through your mind, but through your limbs, your breath, your spine. Fourth, connect your knowledge to something physical. A picture, a place, a movement. If it can live in your senses, it can live in your memory. And finally, fifth, sleep, but lightly, not in exhaustion, not in fullness, but gently, as if tucking the knowledge in. Let the mind file and preserve while the body rests. Neuroscience now tells us that new memories are consolidated during sleep. But Ibn Sina told us that long before labs or graphs. He simply listened, and he knew. But even with all this wisdom, even he, this giant of the mind, sometimes struggled to remember. And when he did, he would rise, wash, pray, sit in darkness, and whisper what he wanted to remember, again and again, until it opened. He said, "Knowledge is light. It is not given to those who live in inner darkness." And maybe that's what all of this is really about. Maybe the truest memory isn't just about facts or details. Maybe it's about becoming light enough to carry them. There's something sacred about the way he approached knowledge. For Ibn Sina, learning wasn't a task. It wasn't a race or a competition. It was something more delicate, more spiritual. It was the process of aligning one's inner world with the order of the universe. To remember, for him, wasn't just to retrieve information. It was to participate in harmony, to be in tune with something ancient and invisible, like listening to the rhythm of the cosmos through the quiet of your own breath. And so, his advice was never cold or clinical. It was tender. When he spoke of memory, he was not talking to machines. He was speaking to human beings, fragile, complex, hopeful human beings who forget things not because they are broken, but because they are overwhelmed. His method wasn't about cramming or forcing. It was about invitation. Invite the mind to return. Create the space. Lower the noise. Remember as a form of respect, not pressure. He told us, before anyone had a name for it, that memory needs a kind of hygiene. Mental hygiene, he called it. Today, we use that phrase to speak about mindfulness, clarity, inner peace. But to him, it was as physical as it was emotional. Clean air, clean food, clean emotions, a calm, simple space in which the mind could stretch and breathe. He saw the brain as a guest house. If it was too crowded, too noisy, too suffocating, nothing new could settle in. But if you cleared the space, if you made the mind gentle, receptive, and quiet, knowledge would come. And stay. So many of us today carry stress like armor. We live in worlds filled with alerts, reminders, interruptions. Our attention is shredded, our minds pulled in 1,000 directions. And then we wonder why nothing stays. But perhaps we need to return to that moonlit room, where a young philosopher once sat in silence, whispering truth into the dark. Avicenna also believed in ritual, not in the religious sense alone, but in the way we move through our day. He believed in rhythm, in creating predictability for the mind, so it could find its own flow. He encouraged us to study in the same place, at the same time, with the same intention, to build consistency into our learning not because it's convenient, but because the brain is a creature of pattern. He told us, don't just learn randomly. Prepare for it. Wash your face. Sit in peace. Let your body know. This is a sacred time. Even something as simple as drinking water before studying, he believed in it. Because it marked the shift. It told the soul, we are entering into focus now. And that kind of preparation isn't about superstition. It's about honoring the moment. turning study into ceremony. But there's more. He spoke of what to do when learning becomes hard, when the words won't stick, when the meanings blur, when the willpower fades. And his answer? It wasn't about force. It wasn't about shame. It was about humility. He wrote, in his own story, that when knowledge closed its door to him, he would rise, make ablution, offer 2 units of prayer, then sit in darkness, alone with the silence and the thought. And there, gently, the answer would come. Not always quickly, but eventually, because he believed that memory is not just a cognitive function. It is a spiritual relationship. And to remember something truly, you must first be in the right state to receive it. He believed knowledge was light, and light does not rest on what is heavy with bitterness or pride. So he urged purification, not just of the body, but of the heart. Do not hold on to grudges, he said. Do not darken your heart with envy or resentment. The mind cannot bloom in a soul that is closed. This wasn't about morality alone, it was practical. A clean heart makes for a clear mind. And perhaps that's the part we forget most today. We search for supplements, hacks, methods. But how often do we pause to ask, am I holding on to something that is clouding my ability to remember? Avicenna believed that learning was not just an act of the brain. It was an act of character. And if we do not tend to the soil of our being, no amount of strategy will bear fruit. He even gave us natural recipes, elixirs from the earth. Not promises of miracles, but careful, gentle support. A drink made of raisins and dry coriander, he said, could sharpen the brain and calm the nerves. Apple cider with honey, to purify the blood and awaken the senses. A broth made of quince, to soothe the spirit and strengthen memory. But he also warned us, do not overconsume. Especially meats. Heavy food burdens the brain. Too much milk dulls it. Too much sleep weakens the senses. Even that, simple as it sounds, was revolutionary. Because he wasn't looking at memory as a machine to fix, but as a flame to protect. Too much wind, and it flickers. Too much fuel, and it smothers. But in the right condition, it glows. And yet, what's most beautiful about his method is how human it is. He didn't pretend to have all the answers. He struggled too. He studied in silence and sometimes found no clarity. He returned to the same passages again and again. He failed to remember, then tried again. But in his trying, he left us a path. And in his humility, he left us a truth. That memory is not a gift given only to the lucky. It is a garden we must learn to tend. With rest, with rhythm, with reverence, and with a heart that is soft enough to let light in. There is a moment in every learner's life, when the books blur into one, when the mind refuses to cooperate, when memory becomes a stranger. In those moments, we reach for techniques. We search online. We compare ourselves. We panic. But Ibn Sina would have asked us to pause, not to chase, to return. Return to the self, to the breath, to the silence between distractions. Because to remember is not always to retrieve. Sometimes it is to realign. He taught us that memory isn't just about recall. It's about resonance. If what we learn does not live in us, if it doesn't echo in our daily choices, soften our speech, or refine our hearts, then we haven't truly remembered it. We've only stored it, not carried it. And there's a difference. You see, for Ibn Sina, memory wasn't about becoming smarter. It was about becoming more present, more awake. He believed knowledge was alive, and anything alive can feel if it is welcome. So the soul must be a sanctuary, clean, open, curious. He wrote that memory improves in hearts that are not burdened by greed. That envy rusts the mirror of the mind. That rushing knowledge, like rushing prayer, misses the point. We are not vessels to be filled. We are fires to be kindled. And then, there's something else. He reminded us. Do not study just to be praised. Do not learn just to conquer exams. Because memory, when it becomes tied to ego, begins to rot. It becomes anxious, fragile, performative. But if you learn for the sake of wonder, for love of truth, for the joy of knowing, then memory becomes generous. It stays with you not because it has to, but because it wants to, like a friend who feels safe in your presence. Ibn Sina also saw forgetting not as failure, but as wisdom. He wrote, "The soul, like the body, forgets what it no longer needs." Sometimes we forget because we've outgrown a truth. Sometimes, forgetting is a form of healing, of mercy, of space-making. He even said, if the mind remembered everything, it would collapse under its own weight. So forgetfulness, too, is sacred. It teaches us humility. It teaches us to revisit, to return, to rediscover with fresh eyes. And maybe that's the point. Maybe we're not meant to remember everything, only that which transforms us. And so, we are left with this. In a world obsessed with speed, Ibn Sina reminds us to go slow. In a world that rewards loudness, he invites us to listen. In a world that tells us to grind, he tells us to breathe, to rest, to walk, to weep if we must. And then, when we return to the page, or to the prayer mat, or to the passing thought that stirs something in us, we return with reverence. Memory, he taught us, is not a weapon to win with. It is a prayer, a process, a peace, and those who walk its path with gentleness will find that the truths worth remembering will never leave them.